recording. All right, we are very good. Welcome. So, what we're going to be doing this morning is start to get some background on the short story the first of two short stories that we're going to read for this project. You may have heard of it or read it before. It's called The Gift of the Magi. All right. And how I want us to get started this morning is thinking about this question that I have up here on my screen. What kinds of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? So you can think about a friend, a family member, loved one, right, a partner. I want you to take a minute or two and answer this question. You can put it in the chat for me. All right. But what kinds of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? All right. There's a lot of different ways to answer this question. You could tell me, like, you know, I would sacrifice X, Y, and Z, or I would make, you know, these kind of sacrifices for this person, right? But however you can think to answer this, I'd like to see something from you in the chat. Again, give everybody a few minutes here to think about and answer this to get us started. What kinds of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? Think about as big or as small as you want to go with this, but think about it, and I'd like to see your answer in the chat, please. All right, let's check the chat out. Any answers for this so far? No, nothing in there yet. All right, let's see if we can come up with something. Hopefully, everybody's still back and with us and wide awake. This is the question we are thinking about right here. I'd like to see at least two answers in the chat before we move on there. So, again, what kinds of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? Oh, excuse me. As you're thinking about this, I can put it in the chat again as well. We have one from Gianni already. Thank you. So now it's in the chat again for everyone to see. Oop, nope, I sent it to Kira accidentally by mistake. Sorry about that, Kira. All right. Jenny said, I would sacrifice everything I own for my family. Kira said, some kill for ones they love, which is true. I don't know if Kira says that's what she would do, but definitely is true. All right. Those are really good, though. Keep them coming. Let's take about another minute or two here. See what other thoughts people have. So I'd like to hear from everybody if we can. So Bree, Kanaya, Naima, any thoughts you guys have, please feel free to share in the chat. Take about another minute or two here. What kind of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? I can share mine while you guys are thinking. Um, when I think about this, I think about not just the big sacrifices, like some of us mentioned, like some people kill for people they love, maybe sacrificing possessions, right? Like I think it was Gianni said, but I also think about sacrificing the little things, like maybe changing some, behaviors that, our partner doesn't really like, or kind of adapting, to what their love language might be. Like, okay, they don't like it when I do this. Maybe I'm gonna try not to do that as much anymore. They don't like it when I run a lot of water and waste water when I do the dishes. So I'm gonna try to conserve water, um, and be mindful of them, and maybe things like that. That's another way to think about this as well. So let me think here. Any other thoughts going in the chat? No. All right, we'll give it maybe another like 30 seconds. Let's see if we can get maybe one more from somebody we haven't heard from yet. For this question, what kinds of sacrifices would you make for a person who mattered to you? Yeah, because again, there's a lot of ways to think about this. We can think about financial or material sacrifices, like okay, I'm giving up these possessions. Um, we can think about emotional sacrifices. Oh, excuse me. We can think about it that way. Let's take about another 30 seconds here and think about this question. Come up with anything else? No? All right, no worries. We still got some pretty good answers in here. Thank you from Gianni. Thank you, Kira. So keep those kind of thoughts in mind as we progress through reading this story, the gift of the Magi, right? Sacrifice and what we will do for others, things like that. Okay. So let's continue on here. All right. Introducing the story. All right. They have each other, but Della and Jim don't have much more than that. Still, it's Christmas, and each wants the best for the other. How much uh, will each one give to make sure the other has a very Merry Christmas? So obviously, this story takes place around Christmas. Um, so our seasons don't quite match here with when we're reading it and when it takes place, but um, those of you who celebrate Christmas will give us a little kind of Christmas cheer in the middle of spring here. But the point of the story is, again, remember what this project is all about. Love. How do we write about love? What are the kind of um, literary devices, figurative language we use to describe our thoughts and feelings on love? And then eventually, how are we going to use all this information to create our final product, right? So that's what we're going to be thinking about, right? A big part of this story is situational irony, right? Situational irony occurs, like you can see from our definition here, when our expectations are contradicted by reality. We believe that one thing will happen, but something entirely different occurs. Situational irony is essential to the meaning of the gift of the Magi. So, can anybody give me an example of uh, situational irony or something that is ironic? Can anybody give me an example, either that's happened to them or that they've seen in a TV show or in a movie, but either in the chat or coming off mute? Can anybody give me an example of irony that they can think of off the top of their head? You can put it in the chat. You can come off mute, but can anybody give me an example of irony or situational irony that they could think of to get us started here? Let's check the chat out real quick. I'll put this in the chat as well. Anybody who can give me an example of a situation that was ironic or situational irony, right? If you're stumped thinking one, here is the example I always use, all right? When they built the Titanic, right? Everybody knows the Titanic, obviously the big movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, right? When they built the Titanic, it was nicknamed the unsinkable ship, right? They thought this ship is built so well, it would never ever sink. And then obviously what happened? It hits an iceberg and it sinks, right? So that is a situation that's ironic, right? It's called the unsinkable ship, so we expect it not to sink, but then in reality, it actually does sink. It turns out it was not unsinkable. So that would be an ironic situation. Can anybody think of another example? Either that's happened to them, that they've seen in a movie, or in something we've watched.
You said an ironic situation.
I did. Can you think of one?
I've been through a lot of ironic situations. Let me think. Wow.
Yeah, if there's one that you can share, we would love to hear it, just to hear another example. So like I was saying, my example that I shared is when they built the Titanic, they called it the unsinkable ship, thinking like, oh, this ship is built so great, it'll never ever sink. But then what actually happened is it hits an iceberg and it does sink, right? So, because remember, that's what situational irony is. We believe one thing is going to happen, but in reality, something totally different happens. So, can we think of any other examples of an ironic situation, either that we've been in, or that we've seen, or watched, or read about? What do we think? Does anything come to mind for anyone? What do we think? Any other ironic situations we can think of, we can come up with? Something in the chat from Gianni. I thought I was going to be late for a job interview, so I called and told them that I would be a little late, and I ended up making there exactly on time. Yeah, that's ironic. All right. Because again, that goes by our definition. We think one thing is going to happen, but something totally different occurs, right? And something that would have been even more ironic is like you get there and you realize, oh, the job interview isn't until tomorrow, right? That would have been even more ironic. But You got it. That's a really good example, Gianni. Thank you. Can you think of one, or should we come back to you in a little bit?
Yeah, I can't think. I don't know. I don't know if I'm gonna be right if I think what I'm like. I know what ironic means, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I just got a lot of memories.
All right. No worries. Well, as we keep going, if you think, oh yeah, this is ironic, then feel free to share. And if not, that is fine too.
Okay.
So again, situational irony, really
Are
big.
we writing something down? Like, are we just going along?
Nope. Yeah, we're just following along for now. But
Okay.
good question. Thank you. All right. So as we continue on here, again, situational irony going to be a big part of this story, the gift of the Magi. So let's put our skills to the test and see if we can find situational irony. Excuse me, in this passage. All right. Dave was thrilled. He just won his first victory as a professional, race car driver. He'd been amazing on the track, reaching incredible speeds and carefully avoiding the various wrecks that had taken other drivers out of the race. He couldn't wait to tell his family about his triumph. He was reliving his masterful driving as he pulled into the driveway and hit the family car. So, when we're finding or looking for the situational irony in this passage, these are the questions we should ask ourselves. What do we expect to happen when a professional driver parks a car? And does Dave's situation match those expectations? So, what is the situational irony in this little passage here? What's ironic about this whole thing? Can we think of anything? Can we pull it out? You can answer in the chat, or you can come off mute. I just want to see who we lost real quick. But what do we think? Hey, what was that? Can I? Yes, welcome back. All right, so what do we think? What is the situational irony here in this passage? Can can we pull the irony out here again? We have Dave, who is a professional race car driver. He just won his first race. He's coming to tell his family about it. As he pulls into the driveway, he hits the family car. Can we find the situation?
Yeah, I agree with whoever just commented.
Oh, all right.
That is ironic.
Let's check chat then.
Like, if you a good driver, what is going on?
Exactly. Yeah, you guys are both right. Kanai and Gianni, thank you. Yeah, so that is the irony, right? Because when we think about these questions, all right, what do you expect to happen when a professional driver parks a car? Like Kanai said, you're professional drivers. You should be good at parking a car, right? And
Yeah,
Dave's
he
just
should know how to move his tires, his steering wheel, his everything.
yeah,
He should be
yes,
the most
exactly.
perfect, top-notch driver in the world, the Parker and
Definitely.
all.
And then we think about, okay, does Dave's situation match those expectations? No. And again, that's what irony is, when what we expect to happen, instead something entirely different occurs. So that is the situational irony here. Our expectation is that Dave won a very difficult race. He must be a skilled driver, but the reality is that maybe he's not so skilled, judging by the looks of family car, because he ends up hitting the car, which they say is actually the case with a lot of professional race car drivers, that in reality, when it comes to like driving in the city or parking cars or stuff like that, many of them are actually not that great at it. But when they're on the racetrack, they're obviously professionals at what they do. And a lot of people think it's because when they're on the racetrack, they're going around in that circle. They don't have to worry about parking. They're going super, super fast, and they're trained just to do that. But then when it comes to driving regularly, it's a different type of driving that they're not thinking about as much. So that is the irony there, right? Really good job pulling that out. Okay. So the story we're about to read, The Gift of the Magi, is one of literature's most famous examples of situational irony. And this is a little excerpt from the story. It says, "Now there were two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair." So just give you a little example of what we're going to kind of peek into here. So as we read The Gift of the Magi, consider your expectations about what will occur. So what do we think is going to happen? And then we'll compare that at the end to what actually happens, right? And we'll see the situational irony might be, okay? The other thing we're going to focus on here is analyzing the details in this story, because writers use details to share information about characters, settings, and events. These details bring the story to life, often showing more than they tell. So as we look at this passage right here, we can see details about the setting, show that the residents seem to take pride in their home, which is the stuff underlined in red. And then other details indicate the neighborhood may be neglected and run down, which are the stuff underlined in blue. So we look at this little passage here. The little house sat on a patch of neatly clipped grass, punctuated by a lovingly tended rose bush. Its front walk, freshly swept and bordered by petunias, led to the crumbling sidewalk that separated the yard from the trash-strewn gutter, meaning trash is kind of thrown all about. So we can see how these details kind of paint a picture in our heads. We call this figurative language, all right? So what we might do, what we're going to be doing after we kind of read the story is go through some of the details, some of the figurative language, some of the symbols that we see, and explain their significance, what it means. Kind of just like this example right here. 60 cents of Dahlia's 187 is in pennies, and this emphasizes how difficult it is for her to save money. All right. So we're going to kind of continue on doing this, right, as we read here. All right, so we can kind of wrap up the PowerPoint there. Questions about anything so far? All right, cool. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try and jump into the story, start reading it a little bit. And then later on today, after I finish updating everything on Summit, I'm going to have the checkpoint, the first checkpoint assigned to everybody, which is basically just going to be kind of like a recap of what we read in the story. And you'll also be able to find the link to the story on Summit as well under that checkpoint. I'll explain all of that in more detail when we meet again on Friday. Okay. For now, like I said, we're going to try and jump into the story with the time we have left. So in the chat, all right, I just put a link to a PDF version of the story. So you can copy and paste that and put it into your browser. I'm also sharing my screen, so you can just follow along with what you see on my screen as well. Okay? So you can see here, not a super long story. We'll probably try and start it today, and we'll finish it up probably on Friday. Okay. So as we read through here, as we read through this story, let's be thinking about paying attention to um, the details we see, the figurative language, the descriptive language we see, and how it might be significant. Let's also be paying attention to, what the situational irony might be. What do we expect to happen, and what actually ends up happening? Okay. So we have The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. All right. $1 and you know what? Let me zoom in on this a little bit here. There we go. Make it a little bit easier for everybody to follow along with. $1.87. That was all. And 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it. $1.87. And the next day would be Christmas. So we can see this story was written in the early kind of 1900s, in the 1920s. So we can see some of that language already. Some words that we might not hear a lot today. All right. And we have already established the next day is Christmas, so we're on Christmas Eve, and Della is counting up her $1.87. And as we saw in that example in our PowerPoint earlier, we know 60 cents of it is in pennies. So these details, are implying that, it's tough for her to save money. So right off the bat here, what can we surmise about Della? Does she seem like she has a lot of money, or does she seem like she's a little bit more of somebody who might be battling poverty? What do we think? How does Della seem so far, just based on that first paragraph there? She seemed like somebody with a lot of money saved up, or somebody who maybe might be a little bit broke. What do we think? All right, if we're stumped on that, no worries. Just keep that question in mind as we progress here, and I'll put it in the chat as well. All right, so I just put it in the chat, so keep that in mind. Think about that as we progress here, and if you can come up with an answer, feel free to throw it up there in the chat. All right. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl. So Della did it, which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. A furnished flat at $8 per week. So we can see, obviously, when this story is set, is at a time in history when stuff is definitely not as expensive as it is now. We're talking about almost 100 years ago, right? It did not exactly beggar description, but it certainly had the word on the lookout for the Mendencancy squad. In the vestibule, or like the um, kind of foyer like entryway, below was a letterbox into which no letter would go, and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also, appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. So, what we're seeing now is they have a letterbox or a mailbox that letters can't fit into. They have an electric buzzer that won't ring, so we can see, their apartment a little bit dilapidated. Not a lot of the stuff works. So again, thinking about that question I put in the chat, does Della seem like somebody who has a lot of money? Why or why not? All right. And like it says here, on that mailbox is the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. So we can see she probably shares this apartment now with somebody else. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during a former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 per week, which would have been a lot of money back then. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting to a modest, unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. So now we know that James Dillingham Young, or Jim, is Della's husband. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with a powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out dully at a gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months with this result. $20 a week doesn't go so far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him. Something fine and rare and sterling. Something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor being owed by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, meaning going across this way, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, going across, up and down this way is longitudinal, my bad. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. So meaning they have a kind of like mirror or window almost that is kind of very stretched out, and you can look very thin in it if you stand the right way. Suddenly she swirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly, she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now there were two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. So we see this excerpt that we saw earlier. Miss Richardson just sent me your new roster, so I'll make sure to get that as well. Now there were two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window some day to dry, just to depreciate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor, with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So some names we may or may not recognize there, but basically what that excerpt is saying is they're so proud of that watch and her hair that even if these super famous people who were super rich had lived there, they would still, be jealous of her hair and his watch. That's how much those possessions mean to them. That's how proud they are of those possessions. And again, we can think about if we've already answered that first question, does Della seem like somebody who has a lot of money? If we answered no, um, maybe this is an indicator as to why. Do we think somebody who has a lot of money would be so proud of these two possessions, a watch and some beautiful hair? So maybe that gives us some insight as to what their kind of financial situation is if you haven't gathered that already. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her, rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly. Once she faltered for a minute and stood still while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, on went her old brown hat. With a whirl of skirts and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sophronie, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up, Della ran and collected herself, panting. Madame, large, too white, chilly, hardly looked the Sophronie. Will you buy my hair? Asked Della. I buy hair, said Madame. Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it. Down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said Madame, lifting the mass with a practiced hand. Give it to me quick, said Della. Oh, and the next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking stores for Jim's present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple and chaste in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone and not by meticulous ornamentation, meaning it's very simple yet sophisticated. It doesn't have a lot of super fancy designs on it, and that's how you can tell it's very valuable, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was like him, quietness and value. The description applied to both. $21 they took for her from it. They took from her for it, and she hurried home with the 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and lighted the gas and went to work, repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love, which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task, right? So we'll stop right there for now. And as we wrap up here, who can kind of sum up what has happened here? All right. I'll put another. So we have we're gonna have two total questions in the chat that I'd like us to answer before we go. All right. So two questions to think about here. Does Della seem like someone with a lot of money? Why or why not? And what has Della done to get money for Jim's present? and why is this important? Why is this a big deal? So I'll give everybody a few minutes here to see if we can come up with an answer for one or both of these questions in the chat. And then we'll kind of wrap up here for today. We should be able to answer, if not both of them, definitely at least one of them, since we just read about what Della has done to get money for Jim's present. So again, let's take a few minutes here. You can answer these in the chat, or you can come off mute and answer them that way. But what do we think for these two questions? What do we think? Any thoughts that anybody can come up with? Are we still out there? Or did my reading voice put us all to sleep?
I'm sorry, I'm not having a good day today. Can I can't be on here.
No worries, Naima. I hope you feel better. I'll see you next time. So those of us who are still with us, any thoughts, any answers to one or both of those two questions in the chat? Does Della seem like somebody with a lot of money? And what did she just do in the part we just finished reading? What did she just do to get money for Jim's present? Can anybody give us their thoughts on one or both of those questions before we wrap up here? Kira, when you say I don't think so, are you saying you don't think that she's a person that has a lot of money? Okay. Yeah, I think you're right too. How can we tell that? What are some things that stood out to you that tipped you off? And that's not just for Kira, that's for anybody. What are some things that show us that Della isn't a person that doesn't have a lot of money? Right? Let's think about what we saw in the beginning. Do we remember how much she was able to save up for Jim's present before she does what she just did at the end of this section? How much was she able to save up? It wasn't a lot, right? Do you remember how much it was? So it was about $1.87, right? And this is also, again, taking place in kind of like the 1900s, 1910s, 20s. So that'd be the equivalent of like maybe around $5 or so, $10 or so today. So definitely not a lot of money. That's all she can save up after a couple months. So, and then we saw the description of their house that, the buzzer doesn't work. The mailbox, can't fit letters into it, probably because they can't afford to fix those things, right? So then, good job, Kira. Thank you. Last question to wrap up here then. Because of that, what does she do to get money for Jim's Christmas present? We just kind of read this section before we wrapped up the reading. What does she do? What does she sell to get money for Jim's Christmas present? Anybody remember? Anybody who can remind us? She sells something that she is very proud of. And if you remember, we talked about there's two things in their house that they are each very proud of. One was Jim's gold watch that was passed down from his grandfather and his father. And there was one other one. Do you remember what that was? Because the second one
It was his. The second one.
The first one I mentioned was his, which was the watch, and the second one was hers. Do you remember what hers was that she was really proud of?
No. Money.
Not money, but she just sold this to get some money to pay for his present. Anybody who can
a
help.
Dress.
No, not a dress, but you're close.
It's a piece of clothing.
Not a piece of clothing, but something that we can style a certain way to match a piece of clothing.
A hat.
Not a hat, but what goes under your hat?
A hair.
Yes.
She had a wig. She sold her wig.
No, she doesn't have a wig. It's her actual hair that was very long. Almost kind of like Rapunzel type stuff, right?
Oh, we finna make some Brazilian bundles out here. Tell her to contact me.
She has this very long, very flowing, very beautiful hair that she's very proud of. But she sells it for about $20. And she takes that money and goes to buy Jim a Christmas present, which is kind of like a sterling silver chain for his gold watch. So what is that? If she's super proud of her hair, if that's her most prized possession, but she sells it to pay for Jim's present, what does that tell us about how she feels about Jim? And that's what we can kind of wrap up here today with. I'll put this in the chat as well. If Della's hair is her most prized possession and she sells it to pay for Jim's gift, what does that tell us about how she feels towards Jim? So if we know her hair is the thing she's most proud of, that she really, really loves it, is super proud of it, but she ends up selling it to pay for Jim's gift, what do we think that tells us about how she feels about Jim? If she didn't care a lot about Jim, would she have sold her hair, do you think? Yes or no?
I said that she sacrificed her hair for him, so she really cared for him.
Definitely, Gianni, you are right on the nose. So we know, yeah, and Kira said the same thing. So this shows us how much she loves him because her hair is such a prized possession. But she says, you know what? Jim really deserves a great Christmas gift this year. So I'm going to cut my hair off. I'm going to sell it to pay for his gift. And so now we'll see what Jim is going to do to pay for her gift when we meet again and wrap this story up. Okay, ladies, really good job today. So nothing due right now. We're going to finish up the story, and then the first checkpoint will be due when we meet. It's going to be due over the weekend, and I'll explain what that's going to be when we meet again on Friday. Okay, so really good job. Thank you for sharing. Stay safe, and I will see you all again on Friday. Okay, see you guys. Good job. If I have you for a second period, I'll see you in a few minutes.